Love you all. We're gonna start 2 minutes.
Oh, hello. We'll get started in just a moment, but it's nice to see you. Hello, and welcome to The Joy of Automating. My name is Franklin Weber. In this episode, we're going to focus on Ohai. Ohai is a tool that detects attributes on your systems. And it's important because the data captured in this way can be stored on your Chef server, and that data can be used in reporting, troubleshooting, and even in your recipes. It's a powerful tool to collect information. And it's something that we don't always think about when we start developing our recipes, building the recipes for ourselves. So in this episode, we're going to work with that. We're going to create an Ojai plugin for an existing cookbook. And then after we get that plugin created, or I guess in the process of creating it, we're going to explore ways to test it because, again, we want feedback fast. We want to make sure that we know our plugin works when we ship the code to someone else. So in this episode, we'll build it and then we'll test it. And we have a little more time. We'll even look at ways we can unit test the code that we write for the Ojai plugin. All right, that's exciting. Let's get started. I already have a cookbook that I've created, and let's make sure that you all have that so you can work along with me. I'll paste that into the chat here. So let me open it up in a browser for you all, and then I'll paste it in the chat, and we'll take a look at the initial cookbook that we're dealing with today. So I've added this to our GitHub page, and here it is. I've decided to label it with the episode information, and it's now in the chat for you. For those watching this video after the fact, you'll find some notes down in the description, of course, that'll contain details about how to get started and additional resources that we discovered during this recording when we go through it. All right, so this is the content. I've cloned this down onto my system. Right now, I've got this currently in this directory that I've called httpd. Now, this is just an Apache cookbook that I've worked with in the test-driven development course that I put together. In this, we have a default recipe that takes care of the installation, configuration, and service of Apache on, I believe, CentOS is the only system. We can tell my implementation by either looking at the recipes. We can also look inside the test. So I'm going to look inside the kitchen YAML file. And I see here that I have this defined for just the CentOS platform. So I'm fairly certain that's all I developed for this one. So like I said, we're going to develop an Ohai plugin. And one of the things that we can develop an Ohai plugin for is developing it, in this case, for any number of things on our system. One of those things could be, in this case, maybe like the Apache modules. The scenario that I always think of, at least with this one, is imagine we deploy a bunch of web servers, and thinking about those web servers being deployed onto that system or these multiple systems, imagine that some are running slower than others, and we need to troubleshoot what those systems are. What's going on in those systems and what's going on, at least with the deployment of the Apache sort of process on these systems. And we could determine that, perhaps the modules, the static and shared modules being loaded on each individual, essentially node is different. And we want to capture that information, collect it, and then do some reporting and examination on that information. Now, that's just one simple example of how you might use an Ohai plugin. In the past, other individuals, I believe Julian Dunn at our organization at Chef, did one to show off how you could detect heartbleed on a system. But there's many different things you can use in terms of determining the installed gems or Python sort of libraries installed on our system. Any type of information that you want to collect that's necessary that would help you in reporting or in your recipes or perhaps troubleshooting is great information to capture. So let's do that. So like I said, we're starting out with this CentOS 7.1 platform installation, and right now we've got this default recipe that deploys Apache. So let's start looking for how to create an Ohai plugin. Now, the thing is, we want to start out by perhaps starting with just the plugin itself, and then we'll come back to actually sort of figuring out how to deliver the plugin. So I'm just going to go to our docs page, and I'm going to go to the docs page, and I'm going to see here. Let's go here, and I'll just type in Ohai. Ohai. All right. Now here's Ojai. I'm going to click on this docs page right here, and it talks about Ojai and has a bunch of information about it. We can look at how to create our own plugin, our custom plugin here, and we can learn about default plugins here. So I'm going to click on custom plugins. Now this shows the example syntax on how we'd actually create the plugin all along here. So this right here is a big sort of section that just contains that information. And if you see, it's another Ruby domain specific language. So that's something that is interesting, right? So something that you'll notice all throughout Chef code is that it's all the same. It's all just sort of Ruby, but it's like with its own sort of domain placed on top of it. In this case, the Ohai plugins. Now, this is something that might be a little confusing at first, like how do I actually use this? And if you're not someone that reads documentation, like I don't read documentation often, and when I say I don't read it often, I mean like I don't read it very well. I oftentimes skim it. I want to see examples. I want to see code that proves itself that it works. And you know what's nice is there are some examples here, but let's actually go to the source. So I'm going to actually go to the source page for our document, the source for Ohai. So I'm going to go to github.com and I'm going to look for Ohai. And I'm going to go and look at the Ohai project itself underneath the Chef repository. So I'm a big fan of looking at source code because what happens is I can learn a lot if I can sort of understand what's happening here. I can see some more examples and perhaps find some maybe trivial examples or real life examples that'll counteract those trivial examples that I saw in the documentation. So Ohai is a Ruby gem, and gems have the same sort of structure of things. You know, they're going to have a gem file, right? They're going to have, that's similar to like, you know, a Burks file. You will oftentimes see something similar to a metadata file inside of here. That's usually the gem spec file here, right? That contains a very similar kind of information. Really, the lib directory is where we're going to find the content that we're interested in most. And inside of lib directory, we're going to find the Ohai directory. And inside that Ohai directory, I believe we're going to find a plugins directory. And here are all the plugins that are, I believe, maybe not all of these ones are loaded by default, but most of these plugins, I think, are loaded, right? So this is a good place to start. Right here is going into the source code for the Ohai cookbook, look inside this plugins directory and see what we can find inside of there. So I like to look at the source code. I like to look at the documentation. I like to have a few places to see. And like I said, there's going to be some good examples here. So let's take a look at one of them. Now, what would be an easy one to take a look at is perhaps one associated with languages. So I'll just pick any one of these languages. Java I'm kind of familiar with, so I'll go with that one. I'll click on the Java one here. So we see here's a basic structure of the Ohai plugin. So this is just another example to kind of complement our documentation. We see here that this one is telling us we set up a plugin, we give it a name, we have this provide section, a depend section, and then here's a function that figures out how to get the Java information. Okay, so it looks like at the end of the day, really what we're going to be doing is a shell out. So really, Ohai plugins, there's nothing really incredibly special about them. They're really just running sort of system commands through this shell out helper and then collecting that data. And then it looks like here, all this code right here is determining how to copy this information into either a hash or a straight up value or something like that. So really, we just need to first figure out what's the command that we want to run on the system. All right, so let's start there. So to do that, we need to have Apache installed on the system. So I'm going to look at our, return back to our sort of system, our cookbook that we have. And I've already set up or created an instance for us with Test Kitchen. So that is going to be nice because it takes about 4 minutes to set up. Here, if I do kitchen list, I'll see that I've got a default instance set up for CentOS. It's already created for me. I'm going to converge it. Converging is going to apply the which recipe. Let's just make sure I've got this right. So if I look at the, in this case, the kitchen YAML file, I see that it's got the HTTPD default recipe when using the default suite. And the default recipe is going to essentially install it, configure it, and start the service. So let's just watch this converge for a moment. And this is one of those times where we can drink a little water, drink some coffee. All right. Well, It made me think, even if we get Apache installed, we need to figure out a way to find the modules from Apache. So I'm going to think about that now. So I'm going to Google or search for that. So let's look at how do I find out the installed modules? So how to find the installed modules for Apache. All right, we'll see what we can find here. So how to check which modules are enabled or disabled. I probably should have prefaced this with like a CentOS or not CentOS, but we'll start with something like this. Yeah, I probably need to make sure there's CentOS because I believe this is maybe Ubuntu. So that's a way to start. So this command will kind of give us some hints. Let's say CentOS just to make sure. And this will kind of take care of, that said Linux, so that was probably all of them. How to list enabled modules. Here's a good one. That I think is probably right. Enabled modules, -m. See, Apache 2 made me think that doesn't exist. Apache 2 sort of sounds like Ubuntu versus CentOS, where Apache here sounds like the right thing. So one of these commands is probably right. Oh yeah, for CentOS, maybe even HTTPD, this one. Oh, this one was saying right here, so let's try that one. Okay, so we'll take a look. This is a good place to start. And let's see how we're doing on the converge. Okay, so we're done. We've done converging the system. I'm going to log into the system. So I'm going to run kitchen login. That's going to log into my only system. And now that I'm logged into the system, I'm going to try out 1 or 2 or 3 of these commands. So let's just start with Apache CTL-M. That looks pretty good. So Apache CTL-M returns me the value. Could not reliably determine the server is full of qualified domain names. So we get a warning, but then it gives us the loaded modules. Okay, so let's just try this one or this one. I mean, if the first one works, we're probably good, but I just want to see if there's any difference between the output. And they look about the same. And then let's try this one just in case. I'll clear the screen. That one works as well. And that one kind of feels a little bit closer to CentOS there. So I think that works pretty well. So it suggested I use the man page. Of course, I'm a kid of another generation. I don't read man pages. I just search for everything off the internet. And I believe everything I read. I'm going to take this command right here, and I feel like that's a good starting point for us to work with. So I'm going to log out of the system now, and now that I've got the command that I want to run, I want to develop the Ohai plugin. So the best thing to do at this point would be to copy a plugin that we've seen before. So where would I want to keep this plugin, and how do I install plugins? Well, Ohai plugins get installed onto the system in a particular directory. So Ohai plugins go into a custom directory that Ohai will load. What we're going to do is just pick a directory, and we're going to make a directory and then put our file in there. And really, we're just going to put a Ruby file. So really, Ohai files are really just Ruby files. So we're going to create a Ruby file. We're going to drop that Ruby file somewhere on the system, and then what we're going to do is just load that somehow. And I don't know the right way, but we'll figure that out as we go along. So let's walk through that process. So I probably need to write a recipe. That recipe is going to take care of distributing that Ohai plugin to the system. So within my cookbook, I'm going to look at generating a recipe. And I'm going to generate a recipe called Ohai plugin. I think that seems all right now. So we might, in the future, have multiple Ohai plugins, or we may just use the same recipe. We may divide it into separate recipes. Who knows? All right, so that's over there. Let's look at the source code over here on the left-hand side. Here's the Ohai plugin recipe. So for here to do is copy our plugin to the remote system, right? So so we want to copy this to the remote system. Now, for us to copy it there, it seems like what we need to do is either provide a file, like a template or a cookbook file or a remote file. It seems like we want to keep this in the cookbook itself, so I probably want to just make this a cookbook file or a template. And because it's source code, normally, I think everything should be a template. But for this case, because it's a Ruby file, and I'm not going to be inserting a bunch of variables into it, I don't think I need to make it a template. So I'm going to make it a cookbook file. So this is one of those instances where I feel like a cookbook file works for me. All right, so I'm going to look at Chef generating me something like a cookbook file. And I believe there's an option here. Yep, Chef generate a file. And I'm going to call this Apache, or in this case, we might want to call it http modules.rb. All right, so this is going to generate me an Apache modules file inside of, the files directory, default HTTP modules. So to do, write the module. So we know that with this command, and I think the command is httpd-m, right? That was the command that we needed to run. All right, so we've got sort of the basic skeleton or structure of everything that we want to create, but now it's time to start working with the actual plugin. So we want to copy this file to our thing. All right, and I'm going to then take a cookbook file. So let's do a cookbook file. So cookbook file, cookbook file. And the location that I want is to be determined. I'm not sure exactly what I'm hoping for in terms of the directory. In this case, I don't know yet. So we'll just figure something out in a little bit. Right now we could pick any location, but let's figure out the source. So the source is going to be our http modules.rb, right? That's that file we just created. I probably want only root to have access to this and ownership of this, and the group should be this. There should be some mode. I probably should set this as 0644 and things like that. Okay, so that'll take care of copying it. Now, the location we want to copy it is kind of interesting. We want to copy it to a location into the system. And ultimately, we could just copy it to any file location that we want. But there is a general convention of where you're going to copy this. And that convention is not enforced by any one particular individual or chef itself, but it's a convention used by the Ojai cookbook. So there's actually a cookbook that helps you manage Ohai itself. So I'm going to look at that in the supermarket. And I'm opening up in the supermarket the Ohai cookbook to kind of take a look at what's being provided. So we're actually going to use this external cookbook to help us take care of some of these conventions, some of these things that take some of the guesswork out of the location and things like that. All right. So here we are. It provides us a plugin path location. And I believe it defaults, as it says here, for Linux installations in that directory right there. So that kind of is nice. So we will have a convention. We'll use that as the plugin path. And I think that works pretty well. The other thing is there's Ohai. So we want to use this cookbook to provide that variable for us. I believe the Ohai cookbook also takes care of something that's super important that we'll talk about after we deploy the Ohai plugin to the system. But first, let's just use this cookbook to give us the variables that we need. We don't absolutely need it, but there's something that's really important that the Ohai plugin does as well, right? We don't actually need a cookbook, right? If it's going to just give us an attribute, we could define it. But what's really powerful is it does this for us, which is it reloads the plugin. So it can distribute the plugin for us and then reloads them with Ohai within the context of the chef run. So that's something that's important to be aware of. When you deploy an Ohai plugin to the system, it's not automatically loaded during the first converge. So this plugin, this cookbook will help our plugin reload immediately and provide data to our node object automatically, like right away during that first run, versus having to wait a run for the file to be distributed and then for a second run to pick up that file. So really, Ohai cookbook is necessary for two pieces. It gives us the path and it gives us this really cool ability of reloading that plugin itself. All right, so we're going to pull in an external cookbook. So we could figure out this path. I think the path, let me figure this part out, right? The path is going to be the Ohai plugin path, and we're just going to call this HTTPD modules, right? So whatever happens to be, we're just going to put in the plugin path and add our plugin from the plugin we've yet to define. But to use this, we need to make sure that we have specified a dependency. So I'm going to open up the metadata file, and I'm going to specify that we have a dependency. So let's say we depend on the Ohai cookbook. Okay, we now depend on the Ohai cookbook, and I believe what we're going to get is of course, our attributes are going to get loaded for us, and we're going to get our path. We now need to learn actually how to use the reload functionality that the cookbook provides to us. But let's just converge the system. And actually, before we converge the system, I want to take a moment to think about this. I could spend about 4 minutes, and actually, what I would probably do if this was a real life case, if I didn't have a time constraint here, what I'd do is develop another test suite. And in that test suite, I'd say, hey, this test suite is all about the Ojai plugin, right? So this is like the Apache modules Ojai plugin test suite. And I would write out, run default, because we need Apache to be installed, of course, and then run Ojai plugin. But in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is simply just add this line to the default one. But I'll comment this one out to kind of give you an idea of what I probably should be doing and what I'm not doing here. But this will make it faster. I don't want to wait another 5 minutes to spin up a machine. So let's go ahead with this. So this is going to converge, and this is going to deploy our Ojai plugin. Let's just make sure that that gets into that directory that we're hoping for. And actually, to make sure it gets into that directory, we could write a test for that. So let's actually write a test. So I'm going to open up the default spec here, and I'm going to make sure that a file gets on the system. And I'm going to make sure that a file gets added. And let's look up the server spec documentation for the file resource. So I'll go to resource type. I'll look for file. Yeah, it tells me a file. So I just specify the path of the file itself. And it should be a file, it should exist. That's pretty good. So we'll just try it should exist. So we want something at, like I said, etsy/chef, I believe Ojai plugin, right? Let's look at the documentation again. So if I come back to Ojai plugins, right here, it says it defaults to Ohai chef Ojai plugins plural. All right, so that's why we have these tests, which is nice. So Ojai plugins. And what we're expecting to see is a file called httpd modules.rb. And that should be present on the system. Like, it should exist. All right, that feels good. So let's just run that test. So I was going to just say, let's log into the system. Let's poke around in the system. Let's see if that file exists. But this is much quicker, right? Running this test will allow me to do all that work that I was about to manually do. So this will save us some time. Right, so I'm going to kitchen converge. That's going to make sure that I've got the updated system. Now again, this recipe that it's applying to the system is going to include, this new Ohai related information. Let's see, good. I've got an error right away, and I'm getting some feedback before I go into the other things. And it tells me Ohai or etsy/chef Ohai plugins does not exist, so it cannot create this file for us. So let's take a look. Maybe this directory doesn't exist because we don't actually essentially run maybe what's necessary inside of some recipe that exists inside of the Ohai cookbook itself. So let's go view the source of it. All right. So I'm going to click on view source. It's going to take me to the Ohai cookbook, not the Ohai sort of utility. And I'm going to look at the recipes, and I'm going to see what recipes there are. So there's only one default recipe. And I know in the past, I've looked at this recipe. It's a pretty tricky one in terms of what it does and what takes place. But I believe most importantly what it's going to do is handle some reloading code and set up some plugin paths for us and stuff like that. So let's actually just use this default recipe. I believe that's what has to be done. So I think if we go back to here, I don't know if it mentions it in the documentation about it, but maybe it's just assumed here. So yeah, it doesn't mention it here in the documentation or the usage. Inspect the Ohai plugin recipe in the Nginx cookbook. So we could go there, but I'll shortcut it a little bit, and I know a few of the secrets here. I've done this before. So we'll go to the Ohai plugin recipe, and what I'm going to say is let's include recipe Ohai : default, or we could just say Ohai. And that'll just include the default recipe. Let's try converging again and see what happens. So the documentation is not so great. I mean, in this case, it tells us a good location to go to, but I feel like we've opened up enough source code locations at this moment to kind of get an idea of what's happening and what we might follow down. And apparently the default recipe does take care of everything that we hoped it would. We see that converge is now much more, it's a longer converge. The custom plugins and other things are sort of taking place. It even reruns Ohai and merges results automatically, it looks like, or possibly. And then it looks like it creates our file. So let's verify that the file actually exists on that system. All right, so Apache should still be up, and we should see that file in that directory. And now we really, at this point, this is the work we have to do, right? We actually have to create the plugin. But we feel like, again, we've got a verification of the steps so far, and I feel confident we're in a good position to move forward from here. All right, so let's actually go and build this plugin itself. So again, I'm going to open up inside the files directory the HTTPD modules. And remember, this is the command that I wanted to run on that system, but I need to place it inside of an Ohai plugin. So I'm going to move my code over here on the left-hand side, and I'm going to open up our documentation over here. And there's many places I can look for this documentation. I can look at, again, an implementation found within GitHub right here and kind of copy and sort of replace the pieces I need. Or I could go to the chef docs and go here and try to pick an example out of here. So there's different ones I could use. And of course, they have sort of the generic templated one, which you might use as well, which sometimes for me, a generic implementation is a little hard to understand. So I'm going to go with actually the real one. So I'm going to go with this Java one as a starting point and see what it is that I need in the system. So here, I'm going to paste this in, and then I'm going to strip out the parts that I don't like. Well, I don't need Java information. I do like some pieces of it, but I have the reference, so I'm going to delete that. I don't need all that stuff. I'm going to delete all this because I think it has real Java. I'm not interested in this. On Darwin, I'm not interested in those things. And I think I see this collect data block. This is calling all those methods, which was get data, get Java, and stuff like that. So really, we want to just say run this command, right? This is where we'd say, hey, grab this command. And now, how do we shove this in, right? I'm not sure exactly yet. Right, so with that in mind, I'm going to go back to the documentation. So what is provides? Provides says languages/Java. So provides, in this case, looks like it creates something underneath, like, oh, hi, it says, hey, let's put this in the languages Java section. That I understand versus attribute sub-attribute. Okay, so in this case, we might say maybe Apache, and then we might say modules, right? So that might be the right way to go. And then it depends on things. I don't think this depends on any plugin. Usually depends means there's some sort of dependency, like we are on the Ojai plugin. In this case, I think the reason why this one was under languages/modules is because it may need that module or that plugin to load up first. We could probably see that if that is a plugin, and it is a plugin. So it's also, there's a languages plugin here. Oh, this example is super simple. I like that one. So, okay. There's a thing called a mash. We'll have to look at that to do. What is a mash? So we got a lot of new questions sort of coming up about this thing. So there's oh, my big head was in the way. There's an implementation just for languages. So I don't think we need the dependency. I feel like we're pretty good with just the setup right here. Now, what actually goes inside this plugin is interesting. So what we want to do is, it says attribute my data. Well, I guess in our case, we want to set up an attribute. And our attribute is going to be, I assume this is the same as attribute here. I assume they mean sort of like languages modules. Oh, that's the Apache one. So wait, oh, I just copied this in. Right, so I don't want languages, I want Apache. And I don't want this called Java, I want this underneath Apache. I assume then I can just use the attribute like this, if that's truly how it is. Let's look at another example to kind of give us the idea. This says it provides cloud, and then we can immediately use cloud right here. So yeah, I think that's true. And then it says it's setting up this mash.new. So I'll say mash.new. Now a mash.new, really, I'll shortcut a little bit of the search for that one. I've looked it up. A mash.new is really just a hash, but it doesn't care whether you use string keys or symbol keys. So honestly, a mash is really just a fancy way of saying hash. So in our case, we'll just go with this mash and just rely on it. Now, we see here, we set up this cloud variable or something like that in this example, and then we start pushing values into it. We just start using it right away like a hash and start pumping data inside of it. So that's something that we should do here as well. So in our case, I guess we need to run the command. How do we run commands? So I remember seeing something that said shell out in our initial example. So maybe we should define our command. Our command happens to equal this fancy command here. We want to say shell out, and we want to say run our command. and we want to store the results here. And then now that we have the results, it looks like from the shell out we have our standard out. So maybe I just want to say shell out. Here's our results, and we want to grab the standard out. Maybe we can just store this under Apache modules, so to kind of get an idea of what it's building. That's what we're going to do here. All right, so I think that's close to what we want to do. You know, in this case, I feel like we've got an implementation that works, but we want to test it, right? So this is the hard part. You write an Ojai plugin like this, and you don't know how to test it, right? It's like, I wrote all this code. How do I actually see it work? So let's do it manually first, because I know how to make that happen, and then we'll write a test for it to kind of see it and explore it. Okay, so let's just deploy this to the system, right? Every time we do kitchen converge, we'll deploy it to the system. So I'm going to run kitchen converge. That should deploy the latest version to the system. In our case, I should see a new version of that file being generated, and there we go, right? I see the difference here being generated on the system with my new data. And if I've got everything right, then I can actually use this plugin. So actually, I'm going to log into that system. And for those that aren't familiar with, you can actually run Ohai on this little system here. So I'm going to just run Ohai here, and that's going to spit out all the data about that sort of virtual machine that I'm on. Now, I can also look at Ohai-help, and I can see that there's a number of different flags you can specify. And one of those flags you can specify is a directory you can add to Ohai search. So you see there it says directory-D, a directory to add to Ohai search path. And what they mean there is the directory in which you can set or specify plugins. So I'm going to run that. I'm going to actually run the command now, but I'm going to specify the directory. So I'm going to say etc/chef, right, Ohai plugins, and that's the directory that gets loaded now, or hopefully will get loaded when we run Ohai. So, oh, well, that raises a good concern. Will that actually get loaded? Who knows? So that's something to figure out. So here we go. If I run this command, it looks like I've got the right answer here. The results are showing me that I've got Apache modules, and we can even run this a little bit further. We could say Apache/modules. Remember, the syntax we can say is show me the attribute Apache, just that one. Show me the Apache/modules, right? I said show me just this attribute, or the sub-attribute of the original attribute. And we'll see here is the detailed output of the module information that it loaded up for me. So this is really great. I've got all the modules loaded on the system when I load this plugin itself. But that's something that doesn't happen automatically. So right now I had to manually do this, right? I had to run Ohai like this to say, hey, load this directory. The thing is, Ohai itself doesn't automatically load this directory. We need to somehow tell it to load this directory. So we've got to update our cookbook so that it can specify it. Now, the location in which you tell essentially chef client to go enforce or load information about Ohai is in the client.rb file. So actually, we'll log back into the system. I'll show you that client.rb file, and we'll look inside of there, and that's actually where we specify the information about how to load or specify the Ohai custom plugin path. And we'll see that in the documentation as well. So let's go back to our documentation. I believe if I scroll back up here to the top, there's all this stuff about custom plugins. And I believe, or at least I hope, there's something about, hey, when you have a plugin itself here, what you need to do is specify how to load that. And maybe it's in the client.rb. Ohai settings in the client.rb. So this is the settings necessary to be added to the client.rb, which is we need to specify any plugin paths being specified. So here we go, an array of paths for the plugin path. So for example, a single plugin path would be like this. So that's something that we could go and manually add, right? We could go kitchen login, and we could manually log into this system, right? And we could edit etc/chef client.rb. Oh, you don't have a client.rb? Oh, I don't even have Vim. Oh, it's not even a file on the system. All right. Well, that's essentially the file that it would get loaded to. In our case, we would need to make sure we take care of this part right here. But we wouldn't want to manually, or we can't manually load that data, right? We can't rely on all our systems to essentially load this plugin for ourselves. And we can't log into every machine and edit the client.rb to add this line. We'd actually have to use another cookbook itself. Another cookbook takes care of modifying that client.rb file, and that is the Chef client cookbook. So despite that we have a working essentially plugin, we still need to figure out a way to actually enable it or turn it on. But let's table that for just a moment, because I said something that really sort of resonated with me, which is I have a working plugin. Do I have a working plugin? I had to log in to sort of prove that out. So before we leave this and worry about any sort of like how to load this plugin, we now know that it works. Let's actually write a unit test that will prove this out. So you remember I wrote a unit test, or excuse me, an integration test that made sure the file existed. What I could also do is write a test that will run the command that I just ran, which was run Ohai. And when it runs Ohai, I could say specify the directory etsy/chef/chef Ohai plugins, right? Find that directory. And I would expect its standard out should match something, which I think should match, if I think about the result set, was something like modules. It should say something like modules in it. And I'd probably even be a little more clear. I could say Apache/modules. And I could say grab that one. And I think even like loaded modules is in that result set. It's not a great test in terms of, you know, do I really care if the word loaded modules are here? Not really. What I'm hoping for is that modules is in the result set of somewhere. So let's just start with this though to get started. Okay, so I'm gonna run kitchen converge just in case I made any changes. I don't believe I did. And now I'm gonna run kitchen verify when this passes and make sure that my system is ready, and that looks good. Okay, so let's do kitchen verify. So if everything is working with this test, I think I should see this Apache essentially modules created, and it does work. So Ohai-D, loading this directory. Let's see it fail though, right? So I feel kind of, whenever I write a test and I've already written the code first, you know, and I've sort of figured out, okay, this is how it works, I always feel bad if it passes right away because I feel nervous that the test that I wrote actually isn't testing what I wanted. So let's change the test slightly so that, you know, we get an error, we get to see some output, we get to see it working for us. All right. Okay, so this, I said, should match this. Let's say it should match supercalifragilistic something. You know, it doesn't matter what. I'm just going to change it slightly, mutate the test slightly. I should see a failure, and in this case I do see a failure. And what's nice about the failure is that it's going to show me, if I scroll all the way up here, that it failed. It says I should match this supercal, typoed as it is. I expected this big blob of text to match supercal, so that's great. That makes me feel good. So now looking at this output, I think loaded modules is all right. You know, we could say that. We could say, hey, at least you have core module. That's probably one that's always consistent and in there in the list. You know, maybe just this sort of sequence of static, who knows. I don't know if any of these are great to pick, but I'll just grab loaded modules at this point. All right, so I feel good about our test, and I feel good about our system, and so now I feel like now we could perhaps have a conversation about how to automatically load this plugin if need be, but we now have a way to prove it. There are other ways to verify this plugin as well. So this is just one way we could have done this. Another way we could have done this is actually, I found this earlier, is we can actually load Ohai itself. So it's testing Ohai plugins in Test Kitchen. I was looking for this, and I found a great project called Ohai Plugins by Racker Labs. And inside of here, they have a number of Ohai plugins that they're using. And these plugins actually have some tests set up for it. So if you look here, test integration server spec, they have a number of tests that they're using. And you know, one of these happens to be an example that just says, hey, run this. And you'll notice they have inside of here this helper sort of constant saying Ohai platform family, Ohai are HCS services and nodes. And when I was reading through this source code, I was wondering, where did they get this Ohai, capital OHAI, because this is not usually present. So looking at the code here, I see this says it requires spec helper, so I'm going to go to the spec helper file, and that's where I'm going to look first. So if I look inside the spec helper file, I find that there is a bunch of setup here that's being done, which is it loads up essentially all the gems here, and then it requires Ojai, and then it does some setup of Ojai. And you see here, there it's setting up the plugin path, right? So it's setting up its plugin path, creating an Ojai object, loading all the plugins, and then storing the data from the Ojai inside of here. So this is another way of doing it. I'll paste this one into the chat for those that are interested in seeing it, and it'll be available in the notes for those following along. This is another way we could have solved it testing-wise. We could essentially go about loading Ojai itself as code and then loading the plugin, and that's probably closer to form to what actually Chef Client is doing when you load it there. Okay, so that feels pretty good. Is another way of possibly testing it, and that's interesting to look at. Now, the thing we also want to take a look at is, again, I said, is loading this alongside of, or at least the first time it runs. So I'm going to go back to, in this case, the idea that I need to make sure that when Chef Client applies this to the system, it automatically will load these plugins. Because as you saw this example that I just left here, it's not automatic. What happens is, Ojai has to be told an explicit plugin path. And we essentially don't have that specified at all. We would specify in our client.rb file. And the only way to add stuff to the client.rb file is either to manually add it or for us to write a recipe to do it. But if you're going to write a recipe to do it, I would encourage you to take a look at the Chef Client Cookbook. Now, most people are using the Chef Client Cookbook maybe for essentially some of its primary recipes. The delete validation recipe is one of those. So if we look at some of the recipes that it provides, here we'll see that it provides a delete validation recipe that deletes the validation key if, from the system if you're still using those, which is nice. It also provides the service recipe, which is probably the most popular one, which takes care of setting up Chef Client to run as a service. So every 30 minutes it will check in with the Chef server. Now, what also is here is a config recipe. And this config recipe takes care of writing details to the Chef client.rb. So the client.rb that's in Etsy/chef. And we can look through here and you'll find it. It's a client.rb. This is a template that they actually write out. So there's a template that gets written out to the file. And you'll see it's got some details about Ohai that it's going on here. So it has a bunch of lists of disabled plugins, and it looks like perhaps some new syntax plugin and stuff like that. So it spends some time writing details about Ohai and everything to client.rb. So we want to use this plugin to deliver that information to the system. So, we want to use this cookbook to help our plugin get loaded. So let's return back to our cookbook. Let's look at or think about what we want to do. So in this case, it seems like what we want is to say, well, besides the recipe default, what we need is, if you're going to use the Ohai plugin, well, you're going to need the Chef Client cookbooks. In this case, right, the config recipe. The config recipe needs to be loaded. Now, I'm just going to save that and I'm going to run that. I know I'm getting an error, but I want to just see the error in particular that I'm going to get. I like seeing these errors to see what happens. So I run kitchen converge here, and it gives me an error, and it tells me no such cookbook Chef Client. So I don't have a Chef Client cookbook specified. Now, that's right? I just added it to the run list, but I didn't add it anywhere. Now, there's two places to add it, and this is a question that comes up sometimes of like, where should you add it, right? Like, if I add this to the run list, is this now a dependency? Like, is this a dependency if I'm working with an Ohai plugin? Maybe, right? Like, if I'm writing an Ohai plugin, maybe there's a dependency that I actually write out to the config location, essentially this modules thing that gets loaded. But it may not be a dependency as well. And if it's not a dependency, well, so there's two places you could put it. If it's a dependency, you want to add it to the metadata. If it's not a dependency, but it's something that exists within your sort of infrastructure, you usually add it to your Burks file. And in this case, I'm going to say it's not a dependency. It's not something that has to be present on the system, but it's something that should be at least present somewhere with my infrastructure. So I'm going to say, let's go Cookbook Chef Client here. So I'm going to specify that inside of my Burks file, and I'm going to return back to the command line and run kitchen converge. Now the nice part is I believe test kitchen is automatically going to read my Burks file, use that to synchronize my cookbooks, right? That's the reason why the Burks file says metadata. It's going to load everything in my metadata, but it's also going to load any of the cookbooks that it also needs as well. So we'll see here, it actually takes care of and loads, the chef client cookbook. And then I believe it runs and applies the config recipe. And if we log into the system, I can show you that file that gets generated. So we'll go into the system. I'll go to etsy/chef. Look here, there's the client.rb file, right? So there's that client.rb file. And in that client.rb file, we have a list of the content here. And it looks like automatically, wow, they didn't have to do any work at all. Right here, it says etsy/chef Ohai plugins. So I didn't have to provide any additional attributes. I didn't have to specify anything. Chef Client actually knew about that. And if you look at the source code for Chef Client, it actually it snoops a little bit. It figures out Ojai is loaded, essentially the Ojai cookbook is loaded, or at least that Ojai plugins directory is already there, and it takes care of adding that for us. So really, this is all the work that you need to do is essentially add Chef Client config to the run list, and it's all good for us. So we could probably write a test for that, right? We want to make sure that maybe a test is there present on the system. So I'm going to return that into here. This is something we might want to test. Maybe not. But for today, I'd like to test it. And we can have an argument about it later, at lunch. When you and I go to lunch, we'll talk about it. It's one of those things. So in this case, the file, this one, etsy/chef client.rb, I believe in our case, should have some content in it. And let's look at the documentation for server spec for the file resource. And I believe we want to say contains. Yeah, so it contains. Its content should match. So in this case, we'll say its content should match. And we want it to match what? I think I copied it. Oh no, I deleted it here. We want to just make sure that it says etsy/chef/ the modules directory, right? If I go back to the line here, yeah, that's it. Now here's a bit of a quandary. When you have forward slashes inside of regular expression, you can go through and you can escape all of them if you want, like this. Some people might opt to do the alternate form, which is I call the lazier form, but also completely valid and wonderful, is changing the external regular expressions to look like that, right? So that's two ways you can write that regular expression. Both of them are valid. All right, so let's just run this test and make sure it's working. So it's one of those things that I manually did, but it's one of those things that, again, I don't want to manually do in the future. So let's run kitchen verify, and let's see that work on the system. All right. That looks good. Sweet. All right, so I feel pretty confident that we've got the plugins loaded. We've got the plugin correctly defined, and I feel like the plugin is in its recipe that it needs, or it is delivered where it needs to be. The one thing to be aware of, and one thing that isn't exposed by the test and the work that we've done. So let me go back here and look at, essentially talk you through what happens with this recipe right here. So what's happening first and foremost is, and I'll use, let me do this to do a little drawing. Oh, I'm duplicating. I don't want to duplicate. I want to draw here. And what happens is, remember, there's an important stage that happens when you run Chef Client. Oops. Let's shrink this a little bit. The chunky font here doesn't work. So when you run Chef Client on the system, so I'm going to run Chef Client. When I run Chef Client, it loads up any of the Ojai information. So, so it's going to load that Ojai information. Remember though, after that, it builds the resource collection. So there's this whole resource collection. And in that resource collection, what we're going to do is essentially this code right here, right? This is building stuff into the resource collection. That's loading content into the resource collection. And the resource collection is just that big to-do list of all that content. And then after it does that, it converges everything. So it converges all the content in the resource collection. That's when this file actually gets created onto the file system. So at this moment, this cookbook file, I'll just call that CF, right? This cookbook file for our module right here gets written to the file system at etsy/chef/Ohai plugins. right? That's when it actually gets dropped in that directory. The problem is Ojai has already been run, right? So Ojai is already finished. And the thing is, Ohai is not going to run or pick this up again until the second time. So really what we need to be aware of is that we are going to have a lag or delay that the first Chef client run is never going to find the plugin. It's going to be the second or subsequent time. So every time we make a change to the source code for our plugin, it's going to need to run twice to see that work. And that's something that I think is not great. Like, I don't think that's a, like, that could cause us some problems. We might forget, we might run it once. It's one of those things where you're like, what's happening? Why isn't it here? It seems like it's not there, and it could cause you some problems. So we want to address that. And we can with a little bit of code that is available inside of the Ohai Cookbook. So the Ohai Cookbook provides essentially two custom resources for us. And the first custom resource that it provides is the ability to reload essentially a particular plugin if need be. So, and this is the situation where we want this, right? We want to say, hey, we want to reload the plugin. So we could say, hey, we want you to reload the Apache plugin. Now remember, we defined it with a capital A Apache inside of the plugin itself. All right, so I'm going to split the screen here. I'm going to show you the plugin itself inside of here. We called it capital A Apache, and it provides this sort of Apache. When you say, hey, the plugin here, we want to use a lowercase version. I'm not sure the exact reason for it, but that's the way it is. We tell it to load this plugin. And the thing is, I believe the default action for Ohai is to reload every single time. But we can take a look at that if we go to the Ohai documentation. So let's actually go to the Ohai Cookbook and take a look at that before I make too many assumptions about how it works. Right, I don't need any of these things, so I'm going to close them. I believe this is the Ohai Cookbook. I'm going to view the source of the Ohai Cookbook. Actually, I could view the source on here, but I could also view the source on my local system. So I'm going to show you just another way you could do that. So on your local system, remember, because we're using Bergshelf to do this, Bergshelf by default is storing all your content in a local directory on your file system. So if I open up my entire Bergshelf directory, I'll see all the cookbooks it actually pulls down. And I believe if we look at this list here, Ohai is one of them. And inside of Ohai, I can actually look at all the recipes it provides, all the resources it provides, and things like that. So let's look at this. There's a hint. There's a hint. Oh, maybe I'm making a wrong assumption here. Is there an Ohai resource just in Chef itself? Maybe I assumed it was in the Ohai Cookbook, but it wasn't. So let's do Ohai resource. I remember seeing an Ohai resource, but I thought perhaps it was in essentially about resources. Let's see here. No, I thought it was inside of this. So resources. Let's take a look. Do I see Ohai on the page? Do I see Ohai? Not just the letter O. Ohai. I see a lot of help about Ohai, but not Ohai itself. So let's go back to the top. And I believe, let's see, here we go. Ohai itself. Okay, so there's Ohai, action reload. So this resource block, so this is something that is standard inside of Chef. I didn't realize it. I thought it was being provided by the Ohai Cookbook. So by default, it's to reload the Chef. So Chef client run, reload the Ohai configuration on the node for the specified, I guess, the specified one that we do. So I'm going to close this out. A bit of a false trail there. So in this case, this is going to reload every single time. But the thing is, we don't want it to reload every single time. If it reloads every single time, that would mean that we'd be reloading Ohai every single time, and it could impact our speed at which we run. And that's probably not a huge impact in this case if the Ohai reload is not terrible, but we might want to say, hey, don't take action all the time. But if we say that, don't take action, when should it take action? And really, the only time it should take action is when this thing changes, right? So if there's a new version of the cookbook file or an updated version, right, of the cookbook file, we really should see that the change here. So this is one of those perfect moments where we can say, hey, I want you to notify. I want you to notify the reload action, and I want you to notify the reload action to the Ohai, the resource. So this is the name of the resource here, right? And I guess this is the resource type, so we'll just say Ohai, and then I want to say the name of the resource, and I'll close this down here. The name of the resource is reload Apache. All right, So that's the name of the resource. And we don't want to reload, the default is to reload delayed, which means at the end of the run, we want this to reload immediately. So we're going to add that little bit of code here. So this is going to take care of reloading immediately. All right, so this is not something that we can actually test. At least it's not something that I think we can test with our code that we have, right? Because really we can only verify that the command we run when we load the directory gives us the content we want. And we can't really see that this works in a chef client run. And we're not looking at the node object. If any of you have suggestions on how that might work, I'd love to hear them, because of course that would increase all of our knowledge. But I'm not sure the right way of sort of testing it truly to make sure that this works in this way. Except maybe some unit testing, which we could look at with, well, we're running out of time, but if we had a little more time, we could do that. All right, so let's just make sure that this converges correctly. So I'll do kitchen converge, and it would create or load new data. Essentially, we could use the node Apache Ohai, and that content, oh, not Ohai, excuse me, modules, that content would have whatever the new content we would specify in it. And that's something that we could do. Like, that's something that we could look at in terms of like using it right away and seeing if it's with the updated information. But I'm not sure exactly what we could do with that. Again, it would have to be a unit test to sort of figure that out. And even then, I don't know if they would be able to really sort of react to this, because this is all about real systems and things like that. So this relationship, I'm not sure how to verify that. I just know that the relationship needs to be there to save us the execution time. So, well, this is exciting. So we've got an Ojai plugin. This is giving us our modules information, and there's still some work that could be done. So we've got a lot of ground that we covered in this hour here, a lot of concepts and ideas, even with just in this simple recipe itself. The idea of reloading the Apache modules that we sort of deliver with the cookbook file, and then this Apache modules that we actually captured. And in this case, we store this information here. There's some cleanup that could be done inside of here. Really, this is just a Ruby block that allows us to write any Ruby code that we want. So this is something you could come in here and refactor. Remember, looking at the code itself, we get an output that I'd say is less than ideal, right? The ideal would be that we'd have an array of each one of the modules. Right now, what we get is a big sort of list, just a big text list of all that content, and that's not so great. So that's something you could come in as well. You could come up with a way if you can. I'd be wonderful to talk with you about it, because I can't think of it. A way to test this relationship right here, because I can't think of a way at the moment to test this relationship and how to sort of ensure that works in the flow here. And then if there was more time, we'd talk about unit testing. So there's a good way to write some unit tests for this. It's pretty tricky, and it involves diving into Ojai, essentially source code, stubbing the content, and sort of running the content. Because really what I dislike is that any small little Ruby failure here requires us to sort of deploy it to the system, see it work or fail. You know, like I could save this right here. I'm going to do a kitchen converge. And let's see if we can get at least an error. Right? That would make me feel pretty good. At least we'd have that coverage. So here I purposely created a typo in the code. And let's just see if this is at least good, because otherwise I would definitely recommend a unit test sort of path. So we've written a badly formed file to the system. And now we're going to run the Ohai command, and we get a failure. And I think that's pretty good. But you notice it doesn't give us any output whatsoever. So right here, I don't see anything that tells us. It says, hey, I should see loaded modules, but it says all I got was nothing. So that doesn't really tell us what was wrong with it. And that's something that I think is really difficult about Ohai plugins, is that if there's any error whatsoever, it purposely sort of hides or obfuscates that error, because, you know, it really just wants to make sure that it doesn't fail upon execution. So unit testing might be another good way. And there's one other thing I would say or suggest. If you look at the Ohai documentation, here for Ojai in terms of the implementation. There's one other, not the Ojai resource. Let me go back to the Ojai documentation that talks about plugins itself. So the custom plugins itself. There is a good example of using a rescue block. Here we go, log entries and rescue blocks. I would encourage you to take a look at this and perhaps redefine this plugin so it uses a rescue block. And if it rescues a failure, in this case a small typo, you could essentially capture or use some default data that says, hey, there's an error or something like that. So that might be another way to follow through. All right, we're definitely out of time. I want to thank you for joining me today. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Happy Friday. Keep automating.